see. I'm super excited. I'm super excited because when we proposed the show, one of the first things I wanted to talk about was Christian nationalism.
Oh.
And I naturally thought of you.
So, thank you.
not that I negatively associate you with Christian.
Right. I wonder if that's a good or a bad thing, you know? Christian nationalism. Oh, Tim Whitaker. Yeah. Perfect.
Yes. Right. Well, I wanted to introduce my show to everyone because I am so thrilled to be given this platform. When I started CounterStory Media, my mission, my tagline is auditing the narrative one story at a time. And what I wanted to do, I started over at Medium, was to take those stories of people that things happen to that we don't often hear their narratives. So we have I started with adoption. I'm adopted, and we don't often hear the life stories of adoptees. So that was my first project. I started a publication called Adoptere. And so we started to audit the narrative, which is pretty hallmarky, of adoption in America through the lens of the children who are now adults who live through that process. And that's become my tagline in a lot of other ways. I also publish the work of veterans because we hear the military complex's version of stuff and the government's version of stuff and Hollywood's version, but getting veterans to talk can be difficult. So when I'm looking at auditing the narrative, one conversation at a time, we're looking at a situation in our government where the conversation around Christian nationalism has been a taboo conversation for a long time. We've accepted sort of the societal narrative that Christians are good people, point blank. And at the base level of that, I would agree with that. The followers of Jesus Christ are good people. I know and love so many of them. But when we look at what Christian nationalism is, and what it's done to our government, what it's currently doing as it's playing out throughout our government, we have to be able to have the conversation and delineate Christian nationalism from the religion of those that follow Jesus Christ. And in approaching that conversation, I met Tim Whitaker several months ago, I believe with Nick Perro on a show for Banner and Backbone. I believe that's where we met. And so when I wanted my first conversation to be about Christian nationalism, my first thought was, I have to have Tim on. So, Tim, I would love for you to introduce yourself and tell everyone why I picked you to talk about this topic.
Well, thank you for the introduction. Congratulations on the new show. And I'm honored to be, I think, the first guest, right? Which means a lot. So thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, the reason you probably called me is because I used to be a Christian nationalist and now I'm not. It's just that simple. I mean, I wasn't as militant as what you see now, but I was certainly in that world my whole life and kind of grew up believing some of the key staples of it. But yeah, I mean, I grew up deeply committed to Jesus in a very white evangelical environment. And long story short, which I'm happy to unpack, I changed my mind on my theology because I couldn't understand the direction that my tradition was headed in. And now what I do for a living is I create content and I help expose Christian nationalism. I also founded an organization called the New Evangelicals, which is now led by Melinda Hale. And it became one of the largest Christian progressive digital platforms out there. And we help people find a better path forward in their faith, rooted in love, justice, and inclusivity, and exposing Christian nationalism. So yeah, that's kind of what I do now. I yap about Christian nationalism all day.
I love it. I love it because it is a conversation that needs to be had. And it's a conversation that's difficult to have because you always have to draw that distinction between, we're not bashing Christians and we're not bashing the religion of Christianity. What we're drawing attention to and critiquing is this movement that has spawned from what was traditionally Christian churches into this Christian nationalist movement. And so I'll give you a little bit of my for why this is important and relevant to me. I was adopted by a pastor at the age of 6 and into a very conservative evangelical home, even if he was a Methodist pastor. And so their theology isn't necessarily as strict, but at home, we were definitely practicing fundamentalist and very, very conservative. And I remained in that world for 32 years and pursued a degree in philosophy to attempt to square the theology in my mind. And so I'm approaching it from the position of someone who really determined after that many years that the theology isn't something that I personally believe in, while I do appreciate and follow the work of Jesus Christ and think that the basis of the Christian faith is found in a man who was humble and good and wanted what was best for humanity. I'm concerned that what has come out of it is very fed into a white supremacist and patriarchal framework. Could you talk about sort of how you view that movement of the church?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, so I think a couple of things that are important to kind of talk about is the reality that no religion, including Christianity, is monolithic, right? Christianity is one word to describe a massive house of Christian thought, right? I mean, we can even start broad and go, there's the Catholics, there's the Protestants, there's Eastern Orthodox. Right away, we have 3 major schisms. So when we say the word Christian or Christianity, what exactly are we talking about? And that's important. That goes for any other religious group as well. And then I think about how the reality is that Christianity has always had an empire building side to it. I mean, it starts really with Constantine. This is not necessarily new. We can look throughout Christian history and see a flavor, or maybe we can say a room or a section of Christian thought that was really focused on conquer and control and building empires in the name of God. And so today, Christian nationalism is another iteration of that ideology in modern America in 2026, right? So you're right. Not every Christian would adhere to these ideals. In fact, I would argue most Christians, even globally, reject such a notion like Christian nationalism. But in the American context, and in other parts of the world as well, this is a major force that we have to confront and be aware of. And that includes Christians like myself really being able to articulate what's going on to an audience that might not have any framework for the world that you and I have come from.
Right. Right. So I'm seeing, oh no, did I freeze?
No, you're good. I see you.
Okay, good. So what I'm seeing, is exactly that. Is a lot of times, so I made a video this morning where I talked about how I think that people thought that the Epstein file revelation would be more of a wake-up call to the hardcore Christian nationalist community. And I said, like, funny. I hate to tell you, but if you come from that world, you understand that pedophilia is not a deal breaker in any way, shape, or form. I have been in a church where a youth pastor had some communication with a teenage girl, and they laid hands on him at the pulpit and prayed for him and prayed for his healing and his salvation, while the teenage girl was sort of in a back room being counseled for her participation in sort of attracting a married man or seducing a married man. And that's the conversation that was had with her. So the Epstein files are not going to be what is some wake-up call to hardcore Christian nationalists. And that's something that we need to really square in our minds, right?
Yeah, I mean, I actually wrote a piece on my own Substack, which is under Tim Whitaker Speaks, about this exact thing months ago when there were rumors that, and we weren't sure yet if Trump was in the Epstein files. I said, look, guys, even if he is, it's not going to change a thing. Like, we have to understand that the white evangelical world is quite okay with this kind of stuff if it's their side. I mean, I think about John MacArthur. He's a massive name in the evangelical world, sold millions of copies of his study Bible, was seen as one of like the fathers of preaching the true gospel. And he passed away last year, but maybe 3 years ago now, there was a massive report that 2 pastors on his staff essayed at some point their own children, one of which is still in prison today for it. And John MacArthur and the church pretty much covered it up. They pretty much hid what happened, and they actually, in one case, shamed the wife of the man who abused his kids. There's actually a video of John MacArthur shaming Eileen Gray for not going back to her husband. And so this comes out, and I'm like, guys, how can you say that this is okay? And really, it gets pretty much ignored. And then when he dies, that world calls him a faithful gospel preacher. By the way, just so people understand, it's even beyond that. John MacArthur said, quote, "Slavery can be great if you have the right master." He's trying to paint the connection between being a slave to Christ and how slavery can be bad, but not that bad. And that's the world that we're talking about. This is who people celebrate when they pass away as good, God-fearing Christians.
Right. So in your opinion, I know this is like a really broad and almost maybe impossible question to answer. To me, it would seem that wealth, money, attachment to money, their own pocketbooks is probably going to be what impacts this Christian nationalist base more than anything, definitely more than the Epstein files, when and if the situations of the economy in the United States affects their wallet. That's when I see some scales falling from some eyes, because I believe that there's also this piece, this prosperity gospel that has fed into the Christian nationalist culture, such that they kind of all feel like they're temporarily embarrassed millionaires, and they do have more in common with Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein than with the Mexican immigrants that live 2 doors down from them. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, it's kind of complicated, and this is why a lot of scholars, write entire books on these topics, because there's a lot of
Yeah.
nuance to it, and frankly, I want to be accurate but also be truthful, right? And certainly, I do believe, in fact, there is a huge sect of Christian nationalism that is more in that charismatic Pentecostal theology, which is where your prosperity gospel comes out of. Then you have your opposite extremes who are not that way, who are also very Christian nationalisty. I'm going to be honest with you. I don't think anything will convince the majority of white evangelicals to shift their allegiance to someone else anytime soon, maybe even not in my lifetime. And I look at the past data of how they've always voted, right? Even before Trump, they were always voting right wing. They voted for Trump in 2016, in 2020, and in 2024 at a rate of 80%. And this is after we saw the insurrection. By the way, if you look at the numbers today, the economy isn't that great. Our jobs market is underperforming. The tariff thing was a complete bust, right?
Yeah.
But they listen to right-wing media pundits that will feed them propaganda all day. There's actually a viral clip that went around of a pundit named Benny Johnson, who's like maybe one of the worst in my opinion, just like ignores reality to push Trumpism. And when the stock market was starting to really tank when Trump first got into office, Johnson told his audience, like, hey, it's only money. Hey, sometimes bad things happen. Now, we both know if this was the Harris administration, Benny Johnson would be saying, look, they're crashing the economy, radical Marxism, right? So there's nothing in my mind that could happen that would convince the masses of white evangelicals to leave, because frankly, Trump does give them access to the power and control that they want, right? White Christian nationalists are all throughout our government. Their megachurch pastors have their own offices. They're invited to do worship services there routinely. They're helping to shape policy. Who cares if their pocketbook hurts? They got what they wanted.
Right. So I want to go back in time a little bit, because a lot of people are like, well, if these people are so horrible, how did they possibly get to this point? So I'm going to go back to 2016 in my life, and then I'm going to ask you to do the same, or whenever it was that you experienced sort of the shift. I call it the scales falling from the eyes. That is the biblical sort of reference.
Yes, it is.
So in 2016, I was attending a church that in the 2 years that I attended, it was such a whirlwind transformation to Christian nationalism from the time I arrived at that church. It was a Southern Baptist church. When I arrived, the reason I began attending there, I was invited by someone who said, we have a pretty progressive pastor. I think you would like it here. And that's why I began going. And it was a Hispanic pastor who I believe was just about the most progressive you can be in the Southern Baptist Church. And that's ultimately why he wasn't kept there.
Yeah, sounds about
But
right.
first of all, having a Hispanic pastor, he was out of politics as well. He was out of the world of politics. He had been a senior staffer for a Republican GOP senator who, God, his tenure was like 50 years in North Carolina. You know how they just stay in office forever. So he had transitioned into, he had been called into the ministry, gone to seminary, and became pastor at this church and was preaching gospel. He was preaching the work of Jesus. And he was one of the pastors who went to the Southern Baptist Convention that year to sign the proclamation on racial equity. And when he returned, and he was tweeting the whole time, and when he returned, it was very clear that the deacons of the church were not okay with what he had done. And within a few weeks, he was gone after preaching a strongly worded sermon where he directly and by name called out Donald Trump. A few weeks later, he's gone. Yep. And what happened in that church was so rapid. It really blew my mind. At this point, I was in small groups. I was in Sunday school. I was in social groups. My kids were in kids groups. We did play dates with other people in the church. And really within a matter of months, people who had their kids fully vaccinated were suddenly distraught that maybe they became anti-vaxxers. They began believing the earth existed. People existed at the same time as dinosaurs. They like lots of really fringe stuff began circling in our church. And one of those was this nationalist thing that we are a Christian nation. And so we must be a Christian government. And so we have to throw our weight behind this guy. This guy is imperfect. Look what God did with Saul to Paul.
Yeah.
We just have to trust. And within just a few months, that church just became an absolute Christian nationalist hotbed, to the point my final sort of straw was entering the sanctuary, and there were American flags all the way lining the perimeter, dozens of them, and an American flag in front of the cross at the altar. And after service began, and all this patriotic music playing, and after service began, we were asked to stand and pledge allegiance to that flag in front of the cross. And I was totally stunned. And also, I stood up and I put my hand and I mouthed the words, because looking around, not a single soul stayed in their seat. And I realized, okay, we've reached a breaking point. I have to get me and my family out of this church. And I wonder if there's anybody else in here that's scared to stay in their seat in this moment. And I realized, holy shit, this is like a cult. This is out of control. This is no longer anything about following the work of Jesus Christ. And the scales fell, and I instantly went downstairs to the children's church, got my kids, and we got out of there and never went back. And it was shocking to me how quickly it happened, and how all of these people were so ready to just be swept along in this wave. So that was my experience. That's when the scales fell. Can you talk about sort of how that process happened for you? And was it a one-day thing like that, like it was for me, or was it a gradual process?
Well, I mean, theologically, it was a gradual process. I always had questions. I was one of the golden children of this movement, right? I mean, I was a virgin when I got married. I did everything right. Did the mission trip work? I was really all in. So I'm not someone who was like a spectator. I was all in on this whole world in every way, shape, and form. And I always had questions theologically. I had some critiques of megachurch culture, even when I was still deeply in that conservative Christian world. But I think the real moment where I was like, I can't ignore the cracks anymore. Like something is deeply wrong. One of the big moments was watching the rise of Trump. And I'll tell you why. You have to understand that when you grow up in this world, you are really taught, and you know this, Melissa, that sexual purity is everything. Your virginity, your sexual purity, how you treat your mind there's a direct connection between how God will bless you and your sexual purity, right? You want a healthy marriage, don't have sex before marriage, right? You want God to bless you, stay sexually pure. I mean, frankly, if I had a girlfriend at age 18 and we were caught in the church just alone doing nothing, that could be cause for like me being off the worship team, the music team, right? I mean, it was a real serious thing. And so I took it seriously. I did the things as best as I could. I did it right, etc. And all of a sudden, these leaked Hollywood Access tapes come out of Trump bragging not just about having premarital sex, but about actually assaulting women. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking to myself, oh, this is a slam dunk. There's no way. There's no way my church culture, my leaders, broadly speaking, are going to go for this, because I know how serious they take this. And when they told me that, we need essentially a commander in chief, not a pastor in chief, and how dare you say publicly that you can't vote for Trump because of these things, my flabbers were gasted. I was like, are you guys kidding me? Like, you're joking, right? You told me that God can't use people who are sexually immoral. And that's part of why I did what you told me to do, because I love God so much. Not to mention,
they pushed for Clinton's impeachment based on sexual immorality, right?
Well, right. I mean, I was born in 88, so my memory at the time was fuzzy, but I've since gone back, and I remember Franklin Graham essentially saying, how can we trust Clinton to lead the nation if he can't lead his family, right? All of a sudden, that's no longer the standard. So that was when I would say, if I was plugging little cracks in the dam, that was when the crack was too big. And I thought to myself, something was wrong. And then from there, you have, of course, the murder of Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd, Breonna Taylor. That started my journey of waking up to the racial disparity in America that I was never taught was the thing. And then COVID, like you said earlier, watching people say the vaccine's the mark of the beast. I'm like, what are we doing here? Like, again, for me, none of this was political, ever. I did not think to myself, I'm going to go from Republican to more progressive. It was always, I want to be faithful to the way of Jesus. If the two greatest commandments, according to Christ, are to love God with all of your soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself, I don't know how wearing a mask during a global pandemic is a sign that I'm a sheep giving into tyranny. In fact, it feels like the opposite. It feels like I'm actually loving my neighbor. So these were all the different things happening kind of at one time that really led me to rethink not my faith, but my theology. What do I believe about God or the Christian faith? Because whatever I'm seeing now, the math ain't mathing.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's something that a lot of people from the outside looking in don't comprehend. A lot of it they don't comprehend. They don't comprehend how, if you've been steeped in this since birth or young childhood, you do think this way. You just think that's the way that it is. And when the outside world, and I have to say, this is why Christian families homeschool. They keep their kids tightly monitored.
Yeah.
Right. Monitored and controlled. They don't allow them to watch secular TV, listen to secular music, all of that. And that's why there's this demonization of higher education, like college as well, because I was definitely questioning in high school for sure. But when I hit college and met new people from different walks of life and also had more authentic conversations with Black people, it really was shocking to then reflect upon the last 4 years of my life in high school and to see how much I had missed out on in the global scope of news and media and perspectives outside of ultra conservative Christian perspectives, and getting those different perspectives helped to open my eyes to, okay, there was some deep-seated racism in my home and in my church. That's one. And that's uncomfortable. So I have to challenge my own thoughts about that and my own behaviors about that. But you begin to wake up. And like I said, for me, that was from 18 until I was 36 was a full awakening. I went to college and with a philosophy major to attempt to square some of these things in my mind that I just couldn't square about the theology. And it's a process. So a lot of people, including myself, I have to totally man in the mirror on this one. I will say, why aren't real Christians standing up more? Why aren't real Christians fighting Christian nationalism and defending the true faith of Jesus Christ? And like you said, there's so many different sects and different flavors of Christianity, first of all. But to that challenge, what would you say when people say, well, if this doesn't represent Christianity, why don't true Christians fight more for that?
Well, really quick, going back to what you said earlier, I just want to riff on it real briefly, and I'll answer that question for you. For people who didn't grow up like how you and I did, it is hard to fathom being taught at like age 5 that if you don't pray a prayer to Jesus, you're going to burn in hell forever. That becomes real. I mean, look, I have 2 kids, they're 3 and 5. And when I tell them something, they just believe me, right? When I tell them this is how it works, there's no questioning. So I understand now what happened to me, right? And to be clear, I think that most parents in this system really think they're doing the best thing for their kids.
Right.
You know, if you really believe that your child one day will end up in a place where they're literally burning forever, wouldn't you do what you had to do as a parent to get them into a place where they don't have that happen to them? Yeah, right. And that in that way, it's logical if you really believe it. It's kind of like growing up in a basement. I use this analogy all the time, where there are no windows, and you have people who just tell you what it's like above ground. They are your interpreter of data. They're the interpreters of the outside world. You only get information through these approved gatekeepers. And then eventually, for whatever reason, you get enough courage to walk up those stairs. Maybe you were abused in the church. Maybe it was because you couldn't reconcile Trump and Jesus. Maybe it was for any other reason. And you walk up, and what you're expecting is you're expecting a desert wasteland. You're expecting to be eaten alive the second you open the door, like it's a stinking zombie apocalypse.
Like it's Fallout.
Yeah. Right. But what you realize is that you're actually beneath a massive house of Christian thought with thousands of rooms and sects and wings all talking about this conversation. And you realize, like, wait a second, I thought the only true Christianity was down there, but it turns out that actually was like terrible. Like the air was stinky. It was poison. You know, I wasn't aware of what was around me. And so a lot of people, when they eventually come out above ground, which by the way, props to you, it's hard to do. It's kind of jarring and it's overwhelming. But it's really liberating, right? Because you realize that, like, you don't have the answers to everything, because that would be impossible. And you realize that the earth and the world is bigger than you, and there's so much more to learn, both inside Christianity and outside of it. So to answer your question, why don't more Christians speak up? I would say they are. You have Christians against Christian nationalism. You have red letter Christians. You have a lot of mainline Protestant major leaders like Jim Wallace and others doing sit-ins and protests, doing what they can. And I think, Melissa, this is no critique of you. I'm saying this is, to me, we overlook the Black church way too often. The Black church, Black liberation theology, the Martin Luther King Jr. civil rights movement is faithful Christianity. That is what faithful Christian embodiment looks like. Is what the Black church has been doing way before you and I woke up out of the basement, right? And so a lot of times when it comes to like white progressives or white evangelicals, and by the way, I say this as someone who is still learning this lesson. What happens is that we think it's all new. Oh, there's these new ways to think. Well, maybe they're new for you, but my gosh, the Black church has been here since the beginning, learning how to resist the empire of white nationalism, especially white Christian nationalism, right? And so I would say that when it comes to Christianity, there are many Christian groups and sects that are working in their own ways to resist Christian nationalism. And that's important to remember. But I would also say that I don't like when people say, well, we're true Christians and these Christian nationalists are not true Christians. That's a no true Scotsman fallacy. And the reality is that Christians can do good things. They can do bad things. You can use the Bible as a tool for liberation, or you can use it as a weapon of oppression. Both can be done. Yes. I refuse to paint my religion as only being inherently good all the time, when the reality is that, like anything else in life, it's complicated.
Yes, exactly. I was so just absolutely blessed and lucky enough to work with Dr. Reverend William Barber down
Oh,
in
yeah.
Bishop Barber
Yeah.
down in Charlotte, North Carolina. Many years ago in 2011, I covered Occupy Charlotte and a lot of the related protests for the Examiner, and following Dr. Barber to the State House on his Moral Mondays, which is where I got inspiration to have my first Monday of this show of every month be Moral Mondays,
I love
where
that.
we're going to discuss situations like this, because I admire him so very deeply. And one of his sort of proteges, my friend Dale, Reverend Dale Benson, embarked from that point on a 10-year discovery where he went to seminary at Duke and challenged these white nationalists to their face. And then he moved to Africa and began a men's retreat in Africa for Black men in America to return to Africa on this Christian spiritual journey. And working with those men, absolutely what you said, it humbled me to realize that this is not new. This has been happening in Black churches and to Black communities, and they've had to square these ideas of Christianity for much longer than we have. And it was such a joy to watch this. And Dr. Barber has a Substack, so I hope that everybody has subscribed and followed him, because that is somebody who, with one or two paragraphs, can just put me down on my seat and like, okay, all right, yeah. Right?
Yeah,
definitely makes me feel like a baby theologian, like a baby philosopher, like, okay, right, we need to reframe where we are. And I read your last piece. Let me pull up the title of that piece, because it was great. My final plea to white evangelicals. And I love the whole piece, but down towards the bottom is where we get into what I think has been directed more at Christian females. Not think I've seen the posts. The social media posts are nuts. But what you say on the topic of toxic empathy, your empathy is God-given. Anyone who tells you to ignore it when they see a child crying as his parent is taken away is not offering a biblical worldview. And then I found it interesting, the verse you quoted, Hosea 6:6, for I desire mercy, not sacrifice, and acknowledgement of God rather than burnt offerings. So God values mercy and obedience over ritual, which brought up a couple of questions. Is the concept of deportation, has that become ritual to these Christian nationalists? And then obedience, the concept of obedience. Now, I'm just going to throw a big fat question at you, because I know you're going to, there's two parts to it. There's that, is the concept of deportation actually ritual, or does it play into the white purity idea of America? And the other one is the question of obedience, because what I draw back to that, because what they'll draw back to is that old Romans 13:1-7, where they will tell you that let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. So are we following the authority of the government, of ICE, of DHS? All right, and go.
Okay. Well, let's handle, I guess, Romans 13 real quick to knock it out of the park. Look, this is what I said earlier, right? You can use the Bible as a tool for liberation or weapon of oppression. And Romans 13, first off, Paul is talking to the church. Let's just talk about the context here. Okay, so it doesn't even apply to entire societies, especially the idea of a secular one didn't exist. But number two, Christian nationalists use that when convenient. Remember, these are the same people who would tell you that mask mandates are tyrannical. This is bad. Whenever it's a Democrat in office, I promise you, they're never going to quote Romans 13. They will then give you the justification on why it's biblical to resist tyranny, and they will pull different Bible verses to make that point. Okay. So
we didn't hear that at all during Obama.
No, or during Biden. I never heard Ali Stuckey, who's the toxic empathy lady, ever quote Romans 13 as a way of saying, look, guys, Roe v. Wade is the law of the land. And Romans 13 says that God has established the governing authorities, so we dare not try and change the laws, right? That's so Scott Coley, he's a author of the book called Ministers of Propaganda. I highly recommend it. He calls this motivated literalism. Okay, and I'm going to boil it down really simple. He essentially says that motivated literalism is what white evangelicals or fundamentalists, Christian nationalists will use to justify why certain parts of the Bible they can take literally, while other parts they can, explain away as not being literal because it benefits them. For example, they will tell you that Romans 13, 1-7 is a literal interpretation of, hey guys, Trump's in office, so obey Trump. But then when Jesus tells the rich young ruler to sell all of his possessions to enter the kingdom, well, that's not really what he means. Yeah, I know Trump is worth a lot of money, but Trump doesn't have to sell all of his stuff, right? That's how they get around this. They're always creating new methods or interpretive lenses. The term might be called, eisegesis is the kind of the more technical term, or exegesis. They're always creating these narratives to justify why their position is right and why you are wrong. But the language that they use is so sneaky, because what they'll say is look, God's word is clear, right? Guys, the Bible is clear on this issue. No, it is not. The Bible is hardly clear on anything, including marriage, by the way. Does Lamech in Genesis 4 take 2 wives? Is that a legitimate marriage? David has 8 wives, right? But then they'll tell you, no, the Bible's clear. Marriage is between one man and one woman for life. Not according to the Hebrew Bible. Not there. So we have to just be really aware of how what they say is not what they mean. You have to be able to decode, and you know this, Melissa, because you grew up this way. You have to be able to decode the presuppositions behind the statements to understand what they mean. Just like when they say, you'll see Trump in his administration say a lot, America, we're doing this for the Americans out there. We're rounding up all the criminals. Well, who are the Americans? Who is an American in this administration's mind, right? Who is it? It's not the citizens, the Americans who were taken by ICE, who were Hispanic and had an accent. It's not those Americans. It's not the liberal Americans. It's not the radical Marxist Americans, etc. It's the same thing here.
Right. So we're going back to the idea of toxic empathy. So for those that haven't followed or don't follow this type of world, what's being told to especially young women in congregations now and on social media through this culture of Christian nationalism is that caring about these families that are being deported and caring about these children is actually toxic empathy, that the left has programmed your mind that you must feel sorry for these people, but that's wrong and that you shouldn't, right? Am I getting that right?
Yeah. So the term started off with a book by a guy named Joe Rigney, who actually was one of the founding pastors of the city's church that got protested recently. Okay. And Joe Rigney he's a big Doug Wilson acolyte. That's Insider Baseball, for those of you who know who Doug Wilson is. And he writes a book called The Sin of Empathy. And then Ali Stuckey, who's a right-wing media pundit, who's also very much in this evangelical world, writes a book called Toxic Empathy. And she essentially makes the point that, look, empathy can be right, but when empathy causes us to sin or to endorse positions that are sinful, that's when it becomes toxic. And of course, she applies it to all the culture war issues, right? Toxic empathy towards our trans neighbors who want health care, toxic empathy towards the woman who wants to or needs an abortion, toxic empathy towards immigration, etc. So yes, if you follow the women's sphere closely, there was a huge push by, dozens of major influencers, from Alex Clark, who's a Turning Point USA person, to Ali Stuckey, to journalist Megan Basham, all making this point that, hey, when you saw 5-year-old Liam get taken by ICE, look, his father abandoned him. And ICE was actually doing the right thing, which is total BS, total nonsense, right? Or when you saw the murder of Alex Preddy, well, he was an agitator, guys, and you can't have empathy for that. Even though we all saw the same video footage. We all saw an agent take away Alex's legally owned firearm, and then another agent shoot him at point blank range, right? So they have created language and systems to get their audience to first deny what they see with their eyes. What you saw is not what you saw. And then secondly, here's why biblically, right, why you can't show empathy to these people, because here's then they create their frameworks and off you go. That's how it works.
Right. And when I speak directly to the targeting of young women, another trend that has just deeply concerned me because it drew lots of red flags from my time being a young woman in the church and being told that the sexual purity thing and the traditional roles, this should be what you desire. You should be fulfilled being a mom and being a housewife and being at home and supporting your husband and submitting to him in all decisions and leadership. Part of what concerns me is the sort of creep of this idea and how it's even crossing over, I guess you would say, these mega churches that aren't particularly faithful to traditional Christian doctrine, but it's the soft girl movement, and it's a social media thing as well as a church thing, but they're teaching teenage girls, they're going lower and going to teenage girls and enticing them with this soft girl life. You can be pretty, you can be beautiful, and your man will take care of you. So don't go to college because you need to be pretty, and don't go to work because you just need to be pretty, and you can be soft and pretty, and a big strong man will take care of you. And even outside of church, this is spread outside of the church sphere to where young women are becoming conditioned to believe this very traditionalist mindset that did originate with the Christian church, or in this way, which is feeding into the trad wife pipeline. So they're catching them as teenage girls and encouraging them not to go to college, don't get job skills. What you need to do is find you a man to take care of you, and then they can usher them directly into the trad wife pipeline. And then you have women that immediately get pregnant, are locked down, they have kids, and they don't have jobs, they don't have job skills, they don't have education. Most of them have no contributions to their Social Security, and they are locked in. That's locked in. Yeah. And now you have states that are going further to take away the option of no fault divorce. So those young women that are fed into that pipeline are stuck, and they're not going to have the option of a no fault divorce to even begin to climb out of that. So when I look at the whole situation, I go back to the first time I read Anne Lamott. And I started reading Anne Lamott. I don't know if you've read her work, but she came out of a very repressive religious marriage, and she got out, and it was rough for a few years. She worked in restaurants and food service. And in that time, like a lot of us who left the church without a lot of resources and left marriages without a lot of resources, we work food service. We work with immigrants, we work with gay people, we work with trans people, we work with all these people in the back of the house, of the kitchen, that don't go to churches, right? They don't go to our churches. They didn't go to our churches. And through that experience, she began to realize, oh, everything the church told me about these people is wrong.
Yep. Yes.
Somehow throughout that, she has maintained such a lovely, pure connection to Jesus that is still profound to me, that I was not able to, or it didn't work out in my personal theology that way. But do you think that there is a way for us to find our way out of this while still preserving this relationship with Jesus that that most Christians that I know and still talk to have that pure relationship where they understand the spirit of Jesus and can strip away? What do you see for the future of people who believe this way, and for churches that are digging in there and doing that real work? What do you see?
As far as like people who are leaving potentially Christian nationalism, but like still maintaining faith, is that kind of the idea here?
Right.
Yeah. I mean, well, I always tell people, some folks get above ground and they run straight out the door because they've been so hurt, or they're just so over it. And like, that's great. Like, there's no shade to me. It's like, do what you got to do. A lot of us, though, are like, I'm in a huge house. I want to go exploring. I want to open up some of these rooms and kind of see what's out there. And also, like, I'm kind of tired of being forced to choose between God or my neighbor. And then you find out that, like, actually the way that you love God is by how you love your neighbor, right? They're actually quite symbiotic. And look, I mean, the life of Jesus is, for me, compelling. It's even the idea, just for a second, let's just humor the Christian theology of the incarnation, the belief that God took on human flesh in the form of Jesus. Even that idea, when you really consider what's going on, is like profound, because if God could have come to earth however they wanted to come to earth, why would they choose to be born into a feeding trough with animals?
Right.
Like, it doesn't get any lower than that.
Right.
In any way, shape, or form, right? And then you have the empire hunting you down, trying to kill you as an infant. You grew up largely lower class, poor, right? And then you're executed by the state at age 33. That should tell us something in the Christian view about the nature of what God is like, that this God does not favor the empire or the Caesars of the world or the people who are in charge, right? God comes from below and is actually anti-empire. He flips empire on his head in the form of Jesus, because it's Jesus who says, the first shall be last, the last shall be first. That's antithetical to MAGA in every way, shape, and form, right? Jesus tells the parable of the Good Samaritan when a religious leader asks him, who is my neighbor? And the short version is that in context, the Samaritan and the Jewish person did not get along. They were mortal enemies. And Jesus says that Samaritan in this story was the good guy, right? So your neighbor is the person that you think isn't like you. So for me, I would argue that, I just went deeper into my faith. I didn't leave it, because if you look at the life of Jesus, it's constantly a calling from the margins in. Like, the margins are where the center of everything is. That's how Jesus teaches us how to live, whether it's the person with leprosy or whatever it is. And he breaks laws. He breaks the Sabbath over and over again. He commits property damage. He overturns tables in the temple changer. So, and this is why, Melissa, if you listen to any kind of Christian nationalist speak often, you will notice how they rarely quote the red letters of Christ. Rarely.
Yes.
It is such a rarity, because you can't square it. You can't read love your enemy as yourself while you're building new crosses for your enemies. It doesn't work. And so for me, that's how I kind of think about it.
So do you think that there's a good future for the Christian church here because I believe that there's going to have to be some formal legislative political reckoning if we are to proceed with this democratic experiment, if it is to continue and not turn into something else that is not what we would call democracy, then I think core to that and fundamental and key to that would be truly having a reckoning with Christian nationalists. And what do you see for Christianity past that? Do you think that's a thing that is going to have to happen?
I mean, in America, we're going to have to figure this out. I mean, Jamar Tisby often says that history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And we can look at what happens when the church gets in bed with state power. We can look in other parts of history and other parts of the world and see what happens. It's never a good thing. I don't know the answer to that. I'm not sure what it's going to take. I definitely think it's going to take a lot of Christians to really start getting loud and to really push back. I do think that we have to think about, will we need legislation? Because you have to keep in mind, Christian nationalists are not here to work together. They are here to take over. Right. Mm-hmm. They are not, for them, compromise, this is a 4-letter word. You don't compromise, especially when the other side in your mind is demonic or evil. And when you're eroding democratic norms in a society, there has to be a point where you get stopped, not because we don't believe in your right to express your views, but because your right to swing your fist stops where my neighbor's face or my face begins, right? I think also we have to keep in mind a more global perspective. Christianity is not dying. It's not going away. In fact, it's actually exploding in the global South in many ways. And this form of white Christian nationalism really is a blip in the bigger scheme of Christian thought. And so I definitely think that globally, most people, even conservative Christians, look at us and go, you guys are wild. Like, I'll tell you, I know conservative evangelicals in Australia who find it wild that conservative evangelicals here fight so hard for gun rights. They can't believe it. They're blown away that whenever a school shooting happens, it's the white evangelicals saying, we need less gun control. Like, they can't believe that. So I think we have to really understand how much of a bubble we're in, even nationally, to understand, like, yeah, this is messed up and it's powerful. We have to resist it. But also, this does not speak for the broader Christian, tradition.
Right. Yeah. But would you say that it's probably because I don't see a way that we as a nation move past this without, we've all had these discussions with people where we pull up letters from Jefferson and Washington where they personally would say things like we're not a Christian nation, or the Treaty of Napoleon where they said we're not a Christian nation. But obviously conservatives have a different viewpoint, that we absolutely are a Christian nation and we were based on Christian values. And there just seems to be no meeting in the middle on this, at least in the conversations I've had. And so I believe that for us to continue forward with the democratic experiment, there's going to have to be legislation actually delineating in words, in writing, that separation of church and state that seems to be in question. Would you?
Yeah, I think that I think that's important. And also I really think, look, we have to be honest. Right-wing media is really effective at what they do, and they have a church world to disseminate their information from. There is no Turning Point USA on the left. There's nothing like it, right? And I have a ton of reasons on why I think that is and why it's a bad thing, like why it's problematic. But this is, and I think people need to understand, this is not an overnight fix. You don't just sign away a piece of legislation, because it's the mentality, right? There are folks who have been conditioned since the beginning to think, and I'm someone who grew up on talk radio, so I say this from firsthand experience, right? That the Democrats hate God, they hate me, they want to make sure I get put in prison if they ever get power, they want to take away my rights, yada yada yada. That is a hard undoing. That takes a lot of years of re-education, right? When you have a whole ecosystem of books and of curriculum and of people who run the circuit as historians, even though they're not really historians, right? When you have that whole world built, you don't undo that in one election cycle. We need I would argue, a populist movement that is on the left, so to speak, that is really fueled by Black voices in particular, from my point of view. And we really get organized on how we are able to give pushback on a mass scale and debunk the propaganda one piece at a time. But you don't do that overnight. It takes a lot of money and a lot of time.
Oh yeah, I've been saying that flood the zone is something we can do too, and we should be doing it. And that's part of what this show is us at Blue Amp rounding up everybody in our team and saying, we are going to flood the zone. We're going to talk about everything. We're going to talk about it loud. We're going to spread it over as many platforms as possible, because that's one thing. And I hate saying, giving them credit, but you're right. That's something that the right has been excellent as. And I didn't even realize, and I grew up in it and I was steeped in it, but I really didn't fully put a lot of pieces together until reading Jesus and John Wayne was, first of all, the sheer amount of material. It's like a literary paper, right? There's so much information in there. But following the path of Billy Graham. So I'm from Western North Carolina, where Billy Graham is from. His compound is still there. And I really was brought up believing that he was just this good old backwoods gospel preacher that didn't want to hurt nobody. He just wanted to share the word of Christ. And then learning how much he intentionally placed himself in political places, in the White House, in the sphere of politicians, was really mind-blowing and made me zoom out a little bit and say, whoa, I don't even have a grasp on what was happening in my world when I was in that world. So I need to educate myself on the entire plan. And it's been a plan that the right wing has engaged in for at least 40, 50 years. Solid.
If you don't know names like R.J. Rushdoony, you don't know what's going on here. Yeah, honestly, you're right. That book, Jesus and John Wayne by Kristen Dumais, it's really a great read. There are many others. The Violent Taken by Force by Matthew Taylor is also good. It is a deep well. This has been going on for a long time. Trump is not a bug. He's a feature of the system, and the system has been working overtime in places where most Americans don't see it. And media, mainstream media, so to speak, has not covered it at all over the past 2 decades. So it's really gone largely, I would argue, untapped. And by the way, this is also why the New Evangelicals exist. It's a nonprofit that helps people find a better path forward in faith. It's for folks who are looking for a way to not give up their faith in Jesus, but also not give up their love for their neighbor. And that's why it exists. So it's a great free resource for anyone out there who's interested.
Yeah. And I appreciate that resource. Like I said, I went through a lengthy process of my own to ultimately, including going to college to square this and to ultimately realize, and I came into it at 6 years old. I wasn't born into it. And so from the time I entered the church at 6 years old, I realized that some things didn't quite square with me. They didn't quite make sense logically. And so as I evolved out, I realized I never did really believe that there's a heaven and hell and afterlife, and that's okay. That I found my way to a spiritual path that's more aligned with my personal beliefs. But there needs to be like that community. The New Evangelicals is a great community for people who realize that their theology is absolutely that of Jesus Christ, and they need somewhere to go that's healthy. So you have created a great space, and I'm so grateful that all my dear friends that still are Christian have somewhere to go and have resources to have this conversation. And it can be very lonely when you leave the church. The number one thing that's going to happen is you're going to be cut off. And because it's such an insular world, you're cut off from your whole world. All your friends are gone. All your community support is gone. Like overnight, I lost 32 Facebook friends just like that. When I said I'm not coming back to church. And so it's a lonely place to be. So people like you and the organization that you founded is so pivotal, because what that's going to do is not only support people in your faith journey, this organization is going to be one of those incubators, I believe, for those Christian voices that are going to get louder and louder and louder in defense of Jesus and his words and his mission, and in defense of Christianity altogether. So I appreciate you and the work you've done. I am so absolutely grateful that you are my first guest here.
I'm honored. Thank you. It means the world.
Yeah. So what do you have coming up? What do you want to plug?
Well, you ready to plug the New Evangelicals? In fact, so the New Evangelicals has its own podcast, and we just launched a Black Liberation Leaders in the Church series. Today's first episode dropped with my friend Adam Clark, who was mentored by James Cone directly. It's a great introduction to Black liberation theology, so check it out. My personal content is under Tim Whitaker Speaks. I have my own Substack, so subscribing there would be great. All of my content is paywall free, so you don't have to become a paid subscriber to see my stuff. And also, I'm on YouTube. That's my other big platform that I really enjoy being on, as well as Instagram. Anywhere that is at Tim Whitaker Speaks is me, and I really appreciate it.
Awesome. Well, it's been great having you here today. I want to respect your time. I know that you got to be out of here at 3. I want everyone to support us at Blue Ant Media. We are working just as hard and fast as we can. Our team is full of just the most talented, incredible, supportive people. David Schuster of MSNBC and Fox News and NBC and wherever else David Schuster works, kind of leads up our crew, and Cliff Schechter, who is just a force to be reckoned with as he tackles. He's been on like 4 shows today. I mean, he's out here. When I talk about flooding the zone, Cliff is out here just spreading the word and trying to do that. And then we have Ellie Leonard, who is digging through those Epstein files and doing the Lord's work, because I can't read that stuff. I can't do brutal. It. And so doing what she does and taking hours and hours every day to dig through this absolutely sordid material is it's necessary journalistic work, and I can't do it. So we need to be super grateful of everybody that's reporting on the Epstein files and all the content there. And then we have Lawrence Winterman, who is absolutely amazing. He's a science fiction writer, a very talented science fiction writer, but he's been having to write on politics for months now and hasn't been able to get to his work, but he's the engine that's keeping Blue Ant running. And then Dana Dubois, our culture writer, our editor, she's incredible. And gosh, the work that she's put into drawing attention to, she lives in a blue bubble. She lives in Seattle. So her perspective varies a great deal. And that exchange of perspective is what we're doing here at Blue Amp. We bring up, we've got a guest that comes on regularly from Caracas in Venezuela to give us the on the ground perspective in Venezuela. So what we're trying to do here at Blue Amp is to flood the zone. That's what we're doing. We're doing it right back. I hate Steve Bannon with a loathing passion, but I am going to take his approach of flooding the zone. So make sure you've subscribed to Tim Whitaker. You definitely want to follow him and everything he's doing, and subscribe over at Blue Amp to support the work that we're doing, in case we get FBI agents at our door.
You never know.
Now we have to think about. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap up so you can get to where you're going on time. I appreciate this so much, Tim, and I hope that you'll come back on another Moral Monday and we can pick up the conversation.
Anytime. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
All right. Have a good one. Thanks, everybody.